Growing up, I always thought my grandparents were a little strange. When I was in grade school, I would spend the summers with them at their home in rural Georgia. But my grandpa passed when I was 11, so my memories of him are sparse, but I do remember him always reminding me to never ever whistle when I went into the forest. Every time I went outside, he would tell me this. Country folks around those parts can be superstitious for no apparent reason, so I never gave it much thought. It wouldn't be until many years later when I finally figured out what he was warning me about. I took a job with the Forest Service during the summer of 2007. We were clearing some wooded areas for a couple of new roads for more public access onto state lands. They were forest roads, so they didn't need to be perfect, but it was hard work regardless. We had trailers on site to stay in during the project if we wanted. About half the crew lived in the trailers that summer, me included. Strange things happened around the job site all summer. Nothing terrible. No one was hurt, but it was just odd. Things would move at night. We would hear strange sounds after dark. Some of the guys said they had odd dreams, but the weirdest thing that would happen was the voices. We would hear voices calling out to us from the forest at night, telling us to come outside. And if that wasn't strange enough, the voices we heard were those of people we knew, often our co-workers. At first, we thought it was just an elaborate set of pranks that no one would fess up to. We all had different ideas of who was behind it, and none of us agreed. After about 6 weeks of this happening every night, we were fed up. Tempers were high, and work had become miserable. And then, one night after work, when I was sitting outside my trailer with a couple of my co-workers, I heard a voice calling from the forest. This had become a regular occurrence around here, but this time, the voice calling from the forest was mine. My co-workers both looked at me. We had all heard the voice, and its source was definitely not me. Either one of our crew was a damn good mimic, or there was something else going on around here. I got up and walked to the edge of the tree line. I couldn't see anything out there at all. My co-workers tried to get me to come back to the trailer, but I had to know what it was. Some part of me hoped it was just another one of our co-workers being stupid, but deep in my gut, I knew better. I went maybe 15 feet into the forest before I had to turn back. It could have been intuition, or it could have just been my own fear. For whatever reason, I wanted to get out of there. I backed out of the forest, not wanting to turn my back on whatever was out there. I turned around when I got to the clearing and headed back towards the trailer. My co-workers were both standing in the doorway. And then we heard the voice again. My voice. I had enough of this. I went to the other trailers and checked on the rest of the crew. No one was missing, which meant none of us could have been in the forest. I could tell the rest of the crew was freaked out. They heard the voice too and watched me go into the woods looking for it. We were finally all in agreement that this was no friendly prank. There was something going on here, and it felt like something bad. Not a single one of us had any ideas on what it could be, and without knowing what we were dealing with, there wasn't a whole lot we could do. I know it sounds stupid, but we decided to just lock ourselves in our trailers and go to bed. There were 2 or 3 people per trailer, so at least none of us were alone. We bolted the front door shut and all tried to pretend we weren't afraid. I could tell the other guys wanted to talk about it, but none of us had any ideas, so we just didn't. Night was beginning to fall, but no one would be sleeping well that night. I'd almost forgotten about my grandfather and his warnings. It was such a distant memory, but then, out of nowhere, I heard a whistle. It was definitely coming from outside. I opened the window and listened for it again. It was coming from the forest. I knew I should have listened to my grandfather, but I couldn't stand it. I had to know what was out there, and when I heard it whistle, I knew I could call it out. I waited a moment, weighing my decision before I whistled back. Not 5 seconds passed before I got a response. I whistled again. It whistled back to me. The sound of the whistling began to grow closer and closer to the trailer until the creature finally came into view. At first I thought it was a ghost. It looked almost human but deathly pale. It had no hair on its head or anywhere else on its body that I could see. It had arms and legs that seemed human, but it crawled on the ground almost like a monkey. I couldn't see its eyes. They were just black circles against its pale face. The best way I can describe it is if a human skeleton had white skin stretched across it. That's what this thing looked like. We all watched it emerge from the forest. It saw us right away through the open window and began approaching the trailer. I couldn't tell from the expression on its face if it was malicious or curious. One of my coworkers grabbed the flare gun from beneath the couch and took a shot at the creature and hit it dead in the chest. Whatever that thing was, it retreated back into the forest, and we didn't have any problems with it again during the remainder of the summer. I wish I could go back in time and ask my grandpa what it was. He knew about those things out there in the forest. He knew they would come after you if you called them. I should have known something was wrong from the smell. It was rancid, like death 1,000 times over. If you've ever smelled a dead body, amplify it times 1,000 and you'll get an idea. I was ice fishing on a lake in rural Wisconsin, tucked away in my little heated ice shack. It had been a relatively uneventful morning, not much activity below the ice. Around noon, I broke into my lunchbox and pulled out a sandwich, but before I could take a bite, I was hit with that awful smell. I searched the contents of my lunch, but everything in there looked just fine. The interior of the ice shack did smell a bit like fish, I'll admit, but it wasn't anything like that. This smell just showed up suddenly and completely without explanation. It was so strong, I was doing everything I could to keep from gagging. It took me a moment to realize the source of the smell was actually coming from outside my shack. I bolted for the door to get some fresh air, only to realize the situation was worse out there. I saw a couple of other people standing outside their ice houses too, probably experiencing the same phenomenon I was. I yelled across the lake, asking them if they too were out there because of the smell. One of the people pointed at something in the distance. I immediately turned around to look, and was in total shock at what I saw. It was an elk, pure white and completely emaciated. Even from that distance, I could almost count its rib bones. Its fur was as white as the snow, but long and stringy, similar to that of a wet dog. I could see large swaths of red under its neck and across its side. I assumed it was blood from an injury, and it looked like a pretty bad injury at that. Despite what looked like heavy bleeding, the elk walked across the ice without problem. Its legs were long and spindly, but I didn't think that was atypical for an elk. To be honest, I had never seen an elk before. They are extremely rare in this area. We all stood outside our shacks, staring at this elk that appeared to be walking right to us. As the elk approached, the stench got even stronger. It was hard to imagine that smell could be coming from something living, but as the elk came into clearer view, I finally understood why. This was no normal living animal, at least not in the way that we know animals to be. It was clearly alive somehow, but there was more to it. Its whole body was rotten. As it got closer, I could see pieces of its flesh exposed and just hanging from its bones. It was the most disturbing thing I had ever seen in my life. The red in its fur appeared to be a mix of old and new blood. There were areas that were clearly clotted and matted into the hair, while the wounds continued to drip bright red. And if you thought that was bad, it gets worse. The elk's head, well, it didn't have any skin on it. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at, since the creature had white fur. But its head, it looked like the skin of its face had been peeled back and was hanging down around its neck. The hide there was dried up, but still had the fur on it. All the muscles had been peeled away, leaving just the skull and antlers. I couldn't see its eyes, just two empty black sockets. Same for its nose. It looked like a walking corpse, and it smelled like one too. But here was this thing walking straight towards us like it hadn't a care in the world. And then, all of a sudden, it fell through the ice. I don't know how or why. The ice was at least 12 inches thick. There were trucks parked out here. There was no way that thing weighed enough to break through the ice, but it did, and it didn't resurface. As soon as the beast fell into the water, the smell disappeared. I went over to talk to the other fishermen, and they were just as dumbfounded as I was. We all ended up contacting the closest DNR office about the whole ordeal. I felt like a crazy person explaining this story to them, and I wasn't sure if they even believed me. When I went back the following day to retrieve my ice shack, there was yellow caution tape up around the boat launch. I'd say there were at least 7, maybe 8 emergency vehicles there. They let me get my shack off the ice, but said the lake would be closed to the public for the rest of the season. They wouldn't say why, but I knew it had something to do with that elk that fell through the ice. It bothered me for quite some time. I knew there was something more to this story. They knew something, but they weren't about to give out any information. The lake remained closed into the summer. That's when I heard a rumor from someone who lived near the lake. I didn't hear the story firsthand, so I can't say what did or did not happen beyond what I saw myself. But the rumor was that the DNR dredged the lake when the ice melted in the spring, and they found the body of that big old elk. They hooked onto its antlers and pulled it up on shore. There was a truck and trailer there waiting for it, but before they could load the elk's body onto the trailer, it disappeared. Like it got up and walked away after being trapped under the ice for months. Like I said, I can't confirm the end of the story, but none of it surprised me. That thing looked dead when I saw it walking out on the ice. I'm sure it looked dead enough when they pulled it up from the lake bed, but it wasn't. I certainly hope to never see anything like it again, but I'm almost positive it's out there somewhere in the Wisconsin woods. I had an interesting encounter a couple years ago. It's one of those things where you aren't entirely sure what you saw, but you have a good idea, and that's what keeps you up at night. I was working as a park ranger in the Rocky Mountains. I was very passionate about the Rocky Mountains ecosystem. We had seen a ton of forest fires around this time. It had been very dry for several years, so once a fire started, it just spread and spread. Many trees had been wiped out in recent year, and the landscape was just completely charred, and had been for quite some time. It was my duty to watch over one particular area and keep it safe. It felt like quite the reward after something so devastating had happened. I really enjoyed taking care of my area of the park at that time. I felt like I was nursing it back to health, even though I didn't have much to do with it. It was all Mother Nature. But I was still very proud. I was definitely spending a great deal of time there, and I felt like I lived in the park. I know people say you can never recognize anything in a forest, but I can say confidently that I knew my way around the forest. Maybe it's because some trees were missing, but I don't think I could get lost out there. Not in my area, anyway. Because of the fires, we didn't have visitors too often. But I like to check on our progress for rehabilitation. I remember one day in August. It was very warm out. It felt like it could have been a day in July. The sun was really pounding down on my head, so I grabbed a hat. To be honest, I hated wearing hats because I didn't feel like I could be in full awareness of my surroundings. The hat felt like it restricted my sight and hearing for some reason. So I do regret wearing it that day, but I didn't think I was going to be put into the situation that I had found myself in. I remember driving up around a bend, and I wanted to get out and look around, get some nice fresh air, see what things I could find growing. I was hoping to find some fungi. When you find fungi after a fire, it's really beautiful. The mushrooms eat away all the dead tree matter from the fire. They're warm colors. They just look so vibrant against the burnt black mess. There's nothing else like it. It's amazing, and you get a new appreciation for the things nature can do on its own. Anyways, I ended up finding patches of some pyrophilous fungi in different areas. That meant that the forest was healing itself. So, I kept moving on. As I'm looking around, I hear some knocking noises coming a bit north of my location. It sounded like something knocking against wood, like wood against wood. It was hollow sounding almost. At first I didn't really mind it. But then I heard another knock. Wildlife in this particular area would not intentionally knock on something multiple times. That was a habit common in primates. There are no known primates in the Rockies, so I was confused. And then I heard it again. I started wondering if someone else was in the forest with me. They seemed to be mocking me by doing this, like they wanted me to be scared. I stood as quietly as I could. I wanted to be able to hear if something was heading in my direction. I didn't hear any footsteps, but I could definitely hear branches breaking in the distance. I couldn't tell what was making the noises. I couldn't even really tell which direction it was coming from at that point. I just stayed still and tried to prevent doing anything to draw attention to myself. And then, that's when I saw a rock fly past my head. Something was now throwing rocks at me. My heart sank into my stomach. About a dozen yards away was a huge, towering mass. It was dark, and it appeared to be covered in dark brown fur. I could have mistaken it for a bear, but I knew it wasn't. Its arms were much longer and thinner than a bear's, and so were its legs. Its shoulders were massive. And then the thing stood straight up. It was bipedal. It seemed completely natural for it, and it looked very much like a humanoid. It was quite frightening. I wasn't prepared for this at all. And before I knew it, the creature disappeared into the charred landscape, like a chameleon blending into its surroundings. It had a perfect color to camouflage into the burnt remains of the forest. From that point on, anytime I went to the park, I kept my eyes peeled. I wanted to be sure of my encounter. So I wanted to see it for a second time. But despite my best efforts, I never saw it again. I have a close friend that still works as a park ranger there. Occasionally, I'll ask if they've had any encounters or seen any strange creatures in the forest, but they always reply, "I guess I'm not as lucky as you." And I can feel that there is a bit of sarcasm there. But in a way, I do feel very lucky. Don't get me wrong, what happened was frightening, but it was also very magical. It was something that really made me see life in a new way. I have a better appreciation of life and all its secrets. If things like what I had witnessed were seen all the time, they'd lose their luster a bit. It's like the first time you see mushrooms growing out of dead, burnt debris. It's amazing, and I'll treasure it. When I was 16, I went to a party with a few friends. I didn't really care for high school parties, but my friends ended up dragging me along despite knowing I hated it. It was a typical high school party of high schoolers. My friends went about mingling and flirting with other partygoers while I found a comfy spot in the living room. I was bored out of my mind and about to ditch my friends when a few girls came into the living room giggling with a game board. They were conversing amongst themselves, saying they had to try this game. They didn't seem to notice me, and I didn't care at all and was enjoying just sitting in the background. Eventually, they got started as I was standing up to leave. One of them called me over, saying, "Hey, you, we need a fourth person come play with us." I reluctantly figured whatever it was, it would be better than moping around, and so I agreed. I sat down by them, and they opened the game board. Only it wasn't a game. I recognized the board, but had never used one myself. The word Ouija was at the top of the board, and the letters of the alphabet were scattered across. I was intrigued right away as they explained how it worked. If only I could have forecasted the events that would transpire soon after. One girl instructed each of us to place our hands on a wooden piece that had a clear lens at the top. Then the other girl asked loudly if there were any spirits that would like to communicate with us. Instantly, the wooden piece slid up to yes. I hadn't moved it, but I was totally convinced that one of the other girls nudged it in that direction. I chuckled to myself, thinking, all right, they're just trying to mess with me. It was my turn to ask it a question, but I wasn't sure what to ask. Then I thought, let me ask the name of who we were conversing with. The wooden piece shifted around the board as it stopped momentarily on letters, eventually spelling out the name Benjamin. Immediately, one of the girls pulled away and blurted out, "No, no way, who made it move?" We all denied moving it and asked her what had happened, why she got so freaked out. She was clearly shaken up, but eventually calmed down enough to tell us that was the name of her older brother, who had passed away a few years ago. At that point, I could tell she wanted to ask more questions and see if it was in fact her brother. She thought up a question only her and her family knew. We all placed our hands back on the piece and she asked, "How did you die?" The piece shifted around and spelled out car wreck. Her face practically went white when that word was spelled out, which told me that it was correct. I was starting to think this wasn't at all fake and that we had, in fact, made contact with her deceased brother. None of us were pressing on, asking any more questions since she was clearly shaken up. I could tell she was trying her best to suppress emotions but couldn't hold it in much longer and started crying. I felt bad and offered to get her tissues and some water. Having been secluded in the living room, I almost forgot a whole party was going on. I made my way through the crowd and found a walk-in pantry. I found tissues on a top shelf, and as I reached up for them, the door closed behind me and the lights turned off. I gasped and was fumbling for the light switch frantically. I switched the light back on and sighed, resting my head forward on the wall. I turned back around and was met face to face with a boy around 18, wearing a football jersey. I jumped backwards. "You scared me," I yelled. He apologized for the prank and asked if I came to these parties often because he never saw me before. I told him I was dragged into coming, but I never had a desire to be a party goer. He seemed nice and I sort of wanted to chat longer, but I also wanted to get back to comfort that girl. Before I turned to walk away, he said, "Tell Mitchie I'm okay." I cocked my head to the side, thinking he must have mistaken me for someone else. I returned to the group of girls and gave them water and tissues. I asked the girl a few questions, like how old her brother was and what he looked like. She said he was really into sports and especially loved football. She went on about their childhood growing up and all the memories they had together. In the moment, she seemed to really be connecting with me and so pulled out her phone, showing me a picture of them before a football game. I instantly froze. Her brother was the boy I ran into in the pantry. I stood up, shaking and confused. "What kind of sick prank is this?" I yelled. The others looked at me, puzzled. I was mad. I don't know what came over me. It was like I lost control over my body. I could feel it happening to me, and then I said, "Mitchie, I'm okay now." It was my body. I was mouthing the words, but it wasn't my voice. A few seconds later, I snapped out of it and blurted out that I had just seen her brother in the pantry. We then all looked at each other like we knew exactly what had just happened, but none of us said it out loud. This happened almost 10 years ago, and that group of girls and I are very close friends to this day. Granted, we haven't touched a Ouija board since, but that day I believe my friend got closure and was able to move on in a way that she hadn't been able to before. It was the summer of 2019, and a storm came through a few days before we were set to arrive at our campsite. We were heading out for a long weekend and expecting 4 or 5 of our friends to join. We were worried about the conditions of the site after all the rain, but on a positive note, the rain brought relief from a heat wave that had been going on for weeks. The forecast now called for a cooler but clear weekend, so we decided to go camping anyway, despite the possible mess. So, on Friday night we headed out, but we were talking so much on the way, we missed the turnoff for the campground and didn't arrive till after dark. Luckily, there was a full moon that night, and you could see the outlines of the trees around us. I remember thinking that this might not be such a bad place to camp, even if there is a bit of mud. We set up our tents, got some food cooking over an open flame pit, and settled in to enjoy the weekend, hopefully without rain. The hours passed with nothing but conversation to fill them until someone pointed out how noisy the woods were becoming. My ears perked up immediately at the sounds of birds chirping, insects buzzing, and other creatures doing who knows what in the night. I've spent plenty of time camping and on trails, but this was a first for this time of day. We were all starting to get tired at this point, and most of us began to drift off. I remember hearing one of my friends try to stifle his own yawns as he said goodnight. At least 2 others responded with their own goodnights, and we all decided it was time for bed. We rolled out our mats and sleeping bags and settled in. I couldn't tell you exactly when it happened because I fell asleep before everyone else, but someone must have said something because I remember hearing someone talking and another person shush them to be quiet. As I continued to drift in and out of consciousness, I heard my friends up at the campfire pit calling for me. It definitely sounded like something bad had happened, so I jumped up from my tent and ran towards the sound of their voices. When I arrived, they told me that they were sure something was lurking around our campsite. They had heard rustling in the bushes, but it wasn't until they saw a set of yellow eyes peering back at them that they got really scared. They all agreed to stay near the campfire and huddled around it so whatever was out there would know we were a group. I sat with my friends for over an hour as we tried to keep each other awake watching for this thing, whatever it was. At some point, someone mentioned that it might have left since it hadn't been seen again, but I think everyone just assumed it had gone into the woods, but might be coming back. At any rate, we didn't want to take the chance of letting ourselves get too relaxed and decided to take shifts, sitting out and keeping watch. Just after agreeing to the plan, the next thing to happen was the scariest minutes of my life. Off to our right was a loud growl, and the ground rumbled below our feet. Before we could even scream, the creature with the yellow eyes came rushing at us with such speed that we didn't even see him coming. It was so fast, and my memory is really blurry, but this creature looked like a dogman with black fur and glowing eyes. It was on top of us before we knew what happened, and it just kept going from one to the next, swiping its claws at us and stomping its feet. It worked its way around our group, charging at each and every one of us, although it never touched anyone. Each of us have different memories of that night, but I remember that all my head could focus on was the way this thing moved. It's like when you watch one of those dog agility courses and watch how they weave in and out without ever bumping into the others. This creature moved like that, so swift and stealthily, and only by standing on its back legs. It basically used its arms and hands like a human or an ape would. I remember thinking that this was a dogman, and it had to be at least 7 feet tall standing on his hind legs. Its yellow eyes burned through me even when it was looking elsewhere. Combine all of this with a growl so loud that I couldn't think clearly. The creature had finished its attack on everyone else, and then began walking toward me with his head down like a bull ready to charge at anyone foolish enough to stand in front of him. Just then, he stopped dead in his tracks and lifted his head up as if sniffing the air. Without saying a word, he looked over his shoulder and turned around to run into the woods. I've never seen anything move that fast or jump that high before. The strangest part was how quiet it was when it ran off. There weren't any footsteps like you would expect from something that heavy running through the middle of the forest at night. It made no sounds at all except for its breathing, which sounded more dog-like than human-like at this point, but still had an edge to it even if it didn't sound angry anymore. We all sat there shaking and unable to talk at first. And then one of us, I don't remember who said it first, said that they had heard the creature speaking in their heads. They said it was really strange, like they could understand its thoughts, but it wasn't English. They couldn't even put it into words. Others of us had the same experience, but some of us didn't. It's crazy how we each experienced it differently. Either way, we were all now terrified. Those of us who were able to function packed up our stuff, and then we all got out of there. For whatever reason, we all came to the conclusion that the creature just wanted us to leave his land, but he didn't want to hurt anyone. I wonder if we were too close to his lair, or maybe we had just surprised it. I guess we'll never really know. Thank God that nothing bad happened to any of us, but during the encounter it was nothing short of terrifying. We honestly had no idea if we would live or die, and that's not a feeling that goes away easily. It wasn't until the next day that we heard the rumors about dogmen sightings in the area and realized that's what came at us. Knowing that others had also had an encounter gave us the confidence to reach out about what happened. We tried to file a report with the police, but they dismissed our concern and told us to head back home and try to get some sleep since it was probably just a bear. None of us believed that it was just a bear. We all now know dogmen are real and they exist in this area. I was way too shaken up to even think about going camping for a few months, but now I'm back at it. I know, call me crazy, but somehow I feel that I'm more prepared and know what's likely to happen if I ever see one again.